Survival in the Middle Ages wasn't about stockpiling canned beans or learning how to start a fire with a shoelace in your teeth. It was uglier. Grimier. You didn't prep for disaster. Disaster was the default setting. You survived by adapting to a world that was constantly trying to kill you, usually in the stupidest possible ways. Pestilence, war, famine, your neighbor's pig, or some God-haunted sheriff with a bad sense of direction and too much rope. But here's the thing, some of the methods they used to claw their way through that meat grinder, they still work. Maybe not in the way you'd expect, not in the wilderness survivalist sense, but in the boardroom, the street, or the back alley, medieval logic still has teeth. Start with the lie. In 14th century Avignon, where the papacy had set up its temporary golden exile, plague was ripping through the streets like a drunk with a torch in a hay barn. People were dying so fast. The cemeteries looked like bakeries on Sunday. The locals, watching the bodies pile higher than the cathedral steps, decided it had to be the Jews. Of course it was. Convenient scapegoating never goes out of style. They accused them of poisoning wells, not because there was evidence, but because someone had to pay, and the Jews were both available and vulnerable. But one man, a Jewish physician named Jacob Bonnet, survived. Not by pleading, not by hiding, by forging documents that said he had cured Christians, and that the Pope himself owed him money. He invented a favor, a debt, and made himself indispensable to the system that wanted him dead. The Inquisition couldn't hang him without tripping over the church's own paperwork. Sometimes survival isn't about being right. It's about being useful in the right lie. Fast forward 300 miles north to Paris, where in the late 13th century, the air already smelled like piss and ambition. The city had grown swollen with people, waste, and paranoia. If you were a woman selling herbs, even parsley, you risked being accused of witchcraft if you didn't smile just the right way. But the smart ones learned how to survive with a trick that still works in every job interview today: fake authority. One apothecary, named Perinette, pretended she was employed by a noblewoman, not an uncommon bluff, and wore a belt with silver fittings to give the impression of wealth and legitimacy. She sold powders and poultices with French names no one could pronounce, laced her herbs with Latin, and made sure her clients were slightly afraid of her. Not enough to report her, just enough to believe she might be the only thing standing between them and their bowels falling out. Because when your world is ruled by invisible forces, demons, disease, market prices, people will pay for control, even if it's imaginary. Speaking of control, let's talk about the funeral insurance scam in Bologna, circa the early 14th century. The flagellant movement was gaining steam, and people were terrified that if they died without the right rituals, they'd wake up in hell with nothing but a guilt-ridden conscience and no socks. Enter the confraternities, lay religious groups who, for a modest fee, would promise to show up at your funeral, sing for your soul, and bury you properly. Except they didn't. Not always. One record from the Bologna archives shows a man named Stefano de Rossi, who paid the Company of the Holy Spirit for 20 men to carry torches and chant psalms at his brother's funeral. Instead, 2 old drunkards showed up, mumbled something about Jesus, and asked for bread. When Stefano tried to complain, they reminded him that God's mercy wasn't a contractual guarantee. Lesson: never trust a subscription service with no refund policy, even when it's for the afterlife. But if scams were currency, then medieval warfare was a Ponzi scheme with swords. Forget the noble knight charging into glory. Real survival on the battlefield meant eating better than the peasants and dying slower than the guy next to you. And the most underrated tactic? Running away. At the Battle of Courtrai in the year 1302, a bunch of Flemish militia, literal weavers and butchers with sharp sticks, wiped out the cream of French chivalry. Not by fighting fair, but by luring them into a swamp, faking a retreat, and then cutting them down as they bogged their horses in the mud. The French knights drowned in their own arrogance, sweating inside 50 pounds of armor, looking for honor in a ditch. The Flemish didn't care about honor. They cared about killing efficiently. And they lived. Honor gets you a statue. Running gets you tomorrow. Meanwhile, back in the cities, survival was more about manipulating people than stabbing them. Take the beggars of 14th century London, who were by all accounts some of the most ruthlessly adaptive operators in the pre-modern world. One account from the Liber Albus, the city's legal codex, records a group of professional beggars who deliberately mutilated themselves to gain sympathy. One man sliced his leg and rubbed it with salt to keep it from healing, calling himself God's afflicted. Another wore fake boils made of wax. But the king's ordinances weren't against begging. They were against unlicensed begging. You had to know someone, pay someone, have a badge. Sound familiar? Survival wasn't about being pitied. It was about understanding bureaucracy better than your enemies and gaming the sympathy economy before someone else did. Then there's the medieval diet plan, also known as don't eat that. In famine years, and there were a lot people survived by eating things we'd consider panic food, bark, acorns, straw mixed into bread. And in one spectacular case from Estonia in the year 1315, human flesh. Chroniclers record a village that turned cannibal when stores ran out. Not in a frenzied blood ritual, quietly, efficiently, parents offering up the elderly first. What's more disturbing, the act or the calm logic of it? And that brings us to the quietest killer of all, silence, because sometimes survival meant not speaking. In the English village of Elton, around 1390, a woman named Alice Atkins was accused of aiding a poacher, a crime which, under forest law, could mean execution. She didn't defend herself. She didn't cry. She sat in silence while the reeve and the jurors fumbled through contradictory testimony and conflicting dates. One said she was seen near the wood. Another placed her washing linens. Alice never said a word, and the jury, confused, embarrassed, and increasingly bored, let her go. Because silence, in a world drunk on gossip and confessions, could be a shield sharper than any blade. Now, if you think medieval prisons were dungeons full of screams and iron, you'd be half right. But they were also full of debtors, people who survived by going to jail on purpose. In Florence, especially during the Black Death, some merchants would strategically declare insolvency, often with fake books, to be thrown into debtors' prison and wait out the chaos. Better to be locked up with clean water and a bunk than trying to outrun the plague barefoot. It wasn't cowardice. It was risk management. Because survival doesn't care if you look brave, only if you wake up tomorrow. And speaking of the plague, let's not forget the real frontline survivors, the corpse collectors. In 14th century Milan, a man named Matteo de Castello made a fortune moving dead bodies. He didn't have a medical degree. He had a cart and iron stomach. He wrapped himself in wax linen, wore a primitive respirator stuffed with herbs, and insisted on working only at night, not because of disease, but because the neighbors complained. He understood something fundamental. In chaos, someone has to do the dirty work. And those people, if they don't die, come out rich. So did the scribes who copied death warrants, or the monks who forged indulgences, or the women who whispered herbal remedies behind the cathedral's shadow. Survival wasn't noble. It was transactional. It still is. And then there's the art of blending in. During the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when English laborers torched tax records and hunted royal officials, some nobles survived not by fighting, but by dressing down. Literally, there's a record of one steward, Simon de Burley, swapping his coat of arms for a peasant's tunic and hiding in a thatched barn while his manor burned. Others mimicked accents, dirtied their hands, and hoped nobody noticed their shoes. Because in a world where your status could get you murdered, anonymity was armor. Even medieval sex workers had systems for survival that modern workers would recognize. In 14th century Nuremberg, brothels were regulated by the city council. Prostitutes had to wear specific clothing, yellow veils, but they also had weekly health inspections and were protected by ordinances that fined anyone who assaulted them. It wasn't moral, it was economic. The council wanted to control disease and avoid the chaos of unsanctioned sex markets. So the women complied, survived, and sometimes used the laws to sue violent clients. and they often won. Because when the system commodifies you, the only winning move is to become a legal liability. Even peasants had credit scores of a sort. In 13th century Ghent, the local records show that poor families could borrow grain in bad years, but only if they'd previously returned their tools on time or helped fix fences. Social reputation was literal capital. If you were known as unreliable, the grainmaster would mark your door with a chalk cross, not to shame you, but to remind others, not to help. It was the medieval version of Yelp, with starvation on the line. And the only way to erase it? Outperform your neighbors in community labor. Survival by peer review. Now, if all this sounds bleak, congratulations, you're paying attention. The medieval world didn't reward virtue. It rewarded function. You didn't survive because you were good. You survived because you were clever, connected, invisible, scary, or just lucky enough to be standing behind someone taller when the arrows flew. And that's what still works today. The tactics haven't vanished. They've evolved. The fake credentials, the strategic silence, the forged alliances, the weaponized sympathy, the selective invisibility, the monetized fear. You see it in corporate back channels, in legal loopholes, in healthcare codes, in housing markets, in politics. The old survival logic never died. It just changed clothes. So next time someone tells you the medieval world was simple, or that people back then were too ignorant to manage complex systems, remember, they survived plagues, collapses, war, and God's worst mood swings with nothing but sharp sticks, sharper lies, and a little stolen bread. And then look around. How much of that has really changed? Because the real trick of survival, the one medieval people knew all too well, is understanding this. Systems don't protect you. People do. And sometimes, not even them. So, learn to read the room. Learn to fake the oath. Learn when to shut up and when to run. Learn what part of the truth can kill you. And whatever you do, never trust a torchbearer with bad breath. Let's talk about fire and how it became a business model. In medieval Constantinople, fire was a constant threat. Too many wooden homes, too many oil lamps, too many drunks with torches and grievances. But after the fire of 1182, something odd happened. A guild of professional fire watchers emerged, not city employees, but private contractors. Their survival tactic? Show up first, charge for the help later. If your home was burning, they'd douse it. If you agreed to sign over a portion of the land, or at least a bribe, it was disaster capitalism, Byzantine edition. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it is. Help has always come with strings. The lesson? Control the bucket, not the flame. Meanwhile, in 13th century Norway, a man named Halbjorn Johnson learned a different lesson. When the law doesn't protect you, weaponize your own weakness. Halbjorn was accused of stealing sheep, a capital offense, if you couldn't afford the fine. But in court, he did something strange. He collapsed, right there in the public assembly. Started foaming at the mouth, muttering nonsense, biting his own hand. The record from the Frostathing Law Assembly called it the madness of the cold. Today, we'd call it a panic attack, maybe even epilepsy. But to the assembly, it was divine possession. You don't execute a man gripped by God. Halbjorn survived not by resisting the system, but by making himself untouchable within its logic. Sometimes, the most effective power move is looking like someone else's problem. Of course, when diplomacy failed, there was always exile, the medieval version of rage-quitting society. But exile wasn't always punishment. Sometimes, it was strategy. In 15th century Siena, the civic statutes allowed certain political rivals, mostly failed conspirators, to self-exile before sentencing. Why? Because killing them made martyrs. Letting them run made them irrelevant. So the smart ones vanished into the countryside, opened taverns, married into minor noble families, and waited for the wind to change. The Medici did it. So did the Pazzi. Survival, in these cases, meant knowing when to become invisible. The world doesn't crush you if it forgets you exist. And while we're on the subject of forgetting meat, Johanna of Brabant, Duchess, warlord, and one of the most deft survivalists of the 14th century. She inherited a crumbling state and a war with Flanders, Burgundy, and half the Holy Roman Empire, so she rewrote the law. Literally, she issued the joyous entry of 1356, a fake ancient custom, declaring that her rule was sanctioned by tradition. It wasn't. But people wanted it to be true. They were tired, scared, and in need of stability. Her fake charter worked better than any sword. She survived and ruled not by defeating her enemies, but by giving her people a story they could live with. Control the myth, and you control the battlefield. That's not medieval. That's timeless. Now, let's descend back to the streets. Venice, late 14th century. The canals stank of salt, dead fish, and sweat. If you were a sailor, broke, hungry, and desperate, you could do one thing to secure your next meal: tattoo your employer's name into your skin. No, really. Some sailors had the sigils of their ship's patron burned into their forearms, not out of loyalty, but leverage. You couldn't just disappear them into prison or throw them overboard. The name made them property, and property, unlike people, had value. They turned themselves into legal documents, human contracts, survival through branding, literally. Elsewhere, survival took quieter forms. Take the women of Rouen, mid-13th century, who perfected a tactic I like to call the gray zone hustle. They weren't married, but lived with boarders. They weren't prostitutes, at least not by legal definition, but regularly hosted single men, provided meals, laundry, and comfort. When authorities investigated, the women quoted scripture, cited hospitality laws, and argued that charging rent for a bed and a warm meal wasn't a crime. They existed in the blurry space where no law could pin them down without admitting it didn't understand its own rules. Today, we'd call it a loophole. Back then, it was how you ate. Survival wasn't about defiance. It was about exhausting your accuser until they gave up. Let's pivot to war, or rather, not fighting it. In late medieval Bohemia, there's a recorded tactic used by villagers under threat from raiding mercenaries: fake plague. When word came that an army was approaching, villagers would preemptively scatter rotting meat outside their homes, hang red crosses on the doors, and stage funerals with empty coffins. Mercenary bands, already superstitious and always hungry, avoided plague-struck villages like the devil himself lived there. There were no bodies, just the idea of death. And it worked. Because when your enemies fear shadows more than steel, you survive by becoming a shadow yourself. And if pretending wasn't enough, sometimes you sabotaged your enemies in the most medieval way imaginable: weaponized saints. During the War of the Breton Succession, rival factions stole relics, literal bones of saints, from each other's churches. Why? Because whoever had the saint supposedly had God's blessing. One chronicler describes how an army lost morale after their saint's femur was captured and paraded through the enemy camp like a trophy. The tactic wasn't military, it was spiritual optics warfare. Take the other guy's ghost, and his army might break before the first arrow flies. There's a reason propaganda was invented long before pamphlets. Belief kills faster than blades. Let's go further into the rot. 14th century Lübeck, northern Germany. The Hanseatic League ran trade through iron rule and religious theater. If you were caught stealing cargo, the punishment wasn't always death. It was worse. You were tied to the dock, smeared in fish guts, and left for the tide. Not to kill you, but to shame you. The real punishment wasn't pain. It was reputation. Merchants who survived that ordeal were marked for life, but some flipped the humiliation into street cred. One man, Klaus the Younger, became a port guide, charging sailors to hear the story of how he lived through it. He survived by monetizing his lowest moment and turned it into a career. Because if you can't erase your record, you own it. That's a tactic that still works on every influencer platform today. Now, what about food survival? Specifically, surviving without owning land. In late medieval Valencia, a clever class of workers emerged. The gleaners, mostly women, often widows or outcasts. By law, they were allowed to collect leftover grain from fields after harvest. But the smart ones negotiated in advance with landowners. They'd promise prayers or small portions of other goods in exchange for being allowed to glean early. One record from 1431 shows a woman named Isabel selling future gleaning rights, like a futures contract. She didn't just scavenge, she speculated. She had no land, but she had leverage. That's medieval capitalism at work. The poor survived not on mercy, but on predictive power. Meanwhile, in Krakow, beggars used rotating identities to confuse almsgivers. One chronicler complained that he saw the same lame boy in 3 different streets, at 3 different heights, with 3 different voices all in 1 week. Families had scripts, costumes, rehearsed misfortunes. The smart ones cross-trained their kids. Today, you'd call it a grift. Back then, it was breakfast. Because in a world without safety nets, you had to perform your pain just right. Too little, and they'd ignore you. Too much, and they'd arrest you. The best survivors were actors with iron stomachs. And if you think all this scheming was limited to peasants and thieves, let me introduce you to Baldwin IX, Count of Flanders. Disappeared on crusade, presumed dead. But years later, a man appeared in Venice, claiming to be Baldwin, saying he'd survived capture, escaped, and returned to reclaim his lands. Except it wasn't Baldwin, just a clever faker with a good story and excellent timing. He rallied support from Baldwin's old allies, took over a few fortresses, and nearly triggered a civil war before the deception collapsed. What's wild? People still debate whether it was really him. The real Baldwin might have died in a prison cell in Bulgaria, or he might have been reborn as a man who understood one thing: if you can't be the hero of the story, be the sequel. If you want to understand how survival really worked in the Middle Ages, look no further than the Misericord. Tiny ledges carved into the underside of choir stalls. Priests and monks spent hours standing during services, but when no one was looking, they'd lean their weight against these hidden wooden supports. Technically, they were still upright. Spiritually speaking, they were cheating. But everyone knew, and no one said anything. Because even in God's house, the body has limits. The real trick to surviving medieval life wasn't strength. It was understanding what the rules looked like and where they quietly bent. That's why so many tactics that worked back then still work now. It's not about escape, it's about endurance. Take the Paris Butchers' Guild in the late 13th century. These weren't gentle tradesmen. These were blood-slicked gatekeepers who ran the meat economy like a mafia. You couldn't sell a sheep's lung without their say-so. But they had one brilliant trick: public charity as insurance. Every week, they gave leftover meat to the city's poor, not out of kindness, but to buy favor. So when city officials tried to tax them or break their monopoly, the butchers had a built-in riot squad, hungry people who'd suddenly stop getting scraps. Today, we'd call that community engagement. Back then, it was survival by meat-based extortion. Feed the crowd, control the crowd. Or take the Milanese shoemakers, who, in the year 1400, began hiding lead slugs in the heels of their shoes, not for fashion, for brawls. Shoemakers fought, a lot, with competitors, with tax collectors, with drunks. A weighted heel gave you just enough force to knock out a tooth without drawing blood. Legal records show one apprentice acquitted for unintentional injury after a rival's jaw was shattered. The judges ruled it a fall. No blood, no foul. Even violence had its etiquette. Survival wasn't about avoiding the fight. It was about staying just this side of legally defensible. But sometimes, all the planning in the world wasn't enough. That's when people turned to cursed tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with pleas to the gods, demons, or anyone listening. In Roman Britain, dozens have been found in wells. Strike down the thief who took my cloak. blind the lover who betrayed me, punish the merchant who shorted my flour. They weren't just spiritual tantrums. They were survival tactics for the powerless. Because when the courts were corrupt and the guards were deaf, writing your revenge in metal and tossing it to the underworld felt like the only justice you could afford. Even hopelessness had a ritual. But let's not forget the monks, those quiet men of the quill and robe who, far from being serene librarians, were often the most politically shrewd survivors in the room. In St. Albans Abbey, around the early 14th century, the monks found themselves caught between an abusive abbot and a resentful town. So they began rewriting their own history. Literally, they forged documents proving ancient privileges, redrew property lines, and conveniently reinterpreted saints' miracles to support their legal cases. One chronicle suddenly claimed the abbey had healed a blind merchant, the very merchant suing them as proof of divine favor. They weren't preserving truth, they were editing survival. And in doing so, they rewrote the future. Of course, not everyone had scribes. Sometimes survival meant controlling the story with nothing but noise. In late medieval Spain, during food shortages, peasants would organize cacophonies, deliberately noisy parades, pots banging, horns blaring to embarrass landowners into lowering prices. One landlord, in Castile, was so unnerved by the ritual that he abandoned his estate for a week, convinced the devil was at his gate. No threats, no torches, just noise, controlled chaos, public shame. The people couldn't win in court, but they could win loudly. Then there's the quietest survival trick of all, laundering your enemy's sins into your own piety. In medieval Iceland, if someone killed your relative, the law allowed compensation known as wargild, but the really clever ones, they refused the payment publicly, then took it privately. Why? Because accepting blood money made you look weak, but being seen as forgiving, while still pocketing the goods, made you a saint and a landowner. It was reputational aikido, survival by moral theater. And speaking of theater, let's talk about funeral feasts, especially in the slums of 14th century Prague. Poor families would scrape together whatever they had to host a lavish meal after someone's death. Not because they could afford it, but because not doing so meant social exile. One widow was recorded as selling her husband's tools, her bedding, and even her shoes just to pay for a 6-goose roast. When asked why, she replied, "It is the only way to make sure he stays dead." People believed poorly fed ghosts might return. But more than that, they believed the poor who couldn't feed the living deserved to be haunted. So survival meant feeding people who secretly hoped you'd starve just to keep your place among them. Meanwhile, in the dungeons of Avignon, the papal prison held a different kind of survivor, the jailhouse bureaucrat. His name was Guillaume de Fay, and he was a low-level scribe who documented every prisoner's confessions, not out of duty, out of opportunity. He'd rewrite your confession for the right price, soften a blasphemy, tweak a date, lose a page. The official record became a menu of survival options. And over time, he became more powerful than the jailers. Because when history lives on parchment, the pen is the real escape tunnel. And if you're thinking all of this feels familiar, it should. The fake documents, the weaponized noise, the rented grief, the public rituals hiding private motives. These aren't curiosities. They're templates. Templates that live on in corporate HR policies, in courtroom theatrics, in protest optics and social media brands, and backroom favors dressed in righteousness. Because the one survival tactic that transcends every era is this: appear functional enough to be kept alive. In the Middle Ages, that meant sewing for your Lord, praying for your soul, or feeding a mob. Today, it might mean hitting metrics, liking the right post, or smiling during layoffs. Same logic, different stage. The people who survived the Middle Ages weren't the strongest. They weren't the kindest. They weren't even always the smartest. They were the ones who learned to hack the operating system. Sometimes by playing the part, sometimes by rewriting the part, and sometimes when the whole stage was on fire by finding the nearest cart grabbing a corpse, and pretending to be the collector. The system's never been fair, but it has always been playable. So, next time you find yourself wondering how to make it through a world that seems rigged, remember the monks who lied for God, the butchers who fed the poor to protect their profits, the weaver who laced his boots with lead, the woman who sold her shoes to bury her dead. And remember this: they made it. You're not here because someone in your family tree was noble or heroic. You're here because they survived. Badly, brilliantly, barely. So you could too.